Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the South-South Dialogue on Sustainability Lecture Series on African People's Struggles for Liberation. Today we have Lecture 8. It is co-organized by Global University for Sustainability, Lingnan University, Daraja Press, Asian Regional Exchange for New Alternatives, and Green Guan Ecotech Center in Beijing. My name is Situi Jadi Margaret, a founding member of Global University for Sustainability. We provide English, Chinese simultaneous interpretation. You can choose the interpretation at the bottom of the computer screen. We would like to thank today's interpreters, Huang Xiaomei and Li Monghong. Apart from Zoom webinar, we also do live streaming at Bilibili, which is a very popular social media platform in China. There are thousands of young followers who are interested in world politics and eager to learn from alternative thoughts and experience. If you missed the previous lectures, you can go to the Global U website in English and simplify the Chinese to watch the video recordings. We also upload those videos on YouTube. Later, I will type the Bilibili live streaming links and video information in the chat room for your reference. Let me introduce the co-moderator. Dr. Firoz Manji is the course director. He is the adjunct professor in the Institute of African Studies at Carleton University in Canada. He is also the director of Daraja Press, a publisher that nurtures reflection, shelters hopes, and inspires audacity. Now I pass the floor to Dr. Manji. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jade, and thanks once again to the Global University for Sustainability and all those who are involved in this collaboration. And a special thanks to you, Jade, and Professor Kinchi Lau, and the amazing team of organizers, translators, and all those who make this course possible. Today, we are going to be discussing the popular uprisings in North Africa. And I think it's interesting that the date has been chosen as the 60th anniversary of Algeria's political independence. I should also say that we ought to acknowledge the fact that at least 37 deaths were confirmed recently in the killings of migrants in the enclaves of Melela and Ceuta. And this is, and I understand, the highest recorded number of deaths in a single incident over many years of migrants attempting to cross from Morocco to Europe. We should also note that Spain has welcomed 124,000 Ukrainians fleeing from Russia's invasion, and yet they do not allow potential refugees fleeing from wars to die. Those fleeing the war in Sudan are prevented from seeking asylum in Europe, clearly a profoundly racist policy. Of the roughly 2,000 refugees who made the attempt, 1,000, including those handed back by the Spanish police, are detained in Morocco. I hope you don't mind my taking the time to mark this appalling event. Today we have two speakers speaking on the popular uprisings in North Africa. First of all, let me introduce Dr. Hamza Hamouchene, who is a London-based Algerian researcher, activist, commentator, and founder, member of the Algeria Solidarity Campaign, Environmental Justice, North Africa, and the North African Food Sovereignty Network. He is also currently the North Africa Program Coordinator at the Transnational Institute. He's currently the North Africa Program Coordinator there, and his work is focused on extractivism, resource, land, and food sovereignty. He's published widely and has been the author and editor of two books. One, The Struggle for Energy Democracy in the Maghreb and the Coming Revolution to North Africa. in the struggle for climate justice. He has also written widely for newspapers, magazines, and contributed chapters to several books, including two published by Daraja Press, A Region in Revolt, mapping the recent uprisings in North Africa and West Asia, and as well as contributing to Fanon Today, Reason and Revolt of the Wretched of the Earth. A warm welcome to you, Hamza. Our second speaker who will be accompanying Hamza is Muzan Alneel, who is a writer and public speaker with the interdisciplinary professional and academic background, engineering, socioeconomics, public policy. A really remarkable, I think it's wonderful to have a mechanical engineer who is engaged in such a political struggle. Muzan co-founded the Innovation, Science and Technology think tank for People-Centered Development in Sudan. She has previously worked as project manager for engineering projects in the private sector, a volunteering consultant on the industrial policy in the Industrial Research and Consultancy Center in Sudan, and a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, focusing on people-centric approach to economic, industry, and environment in Sudan. She is currently the managing director of the Innovation, Science and Technology think tank, and she holds, as I said, a master's of engineering in technical engagement and a bachelor engineering in mechanical engineering. A really warm welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us on this panel. Over to you to lead the discussion for this morning.
Thanks, Firoz, for the great introductions, and thanks for all the organizers in giving us this opportunity, me and Muzan, in sharing our reflections and analysis about the uprisings in the region. I really hope that we can reflect together and also learn together. We prepared a PowerPoint presentation with some videos, so I'm gonna share the screen with you now. So before we jump into the details and our reflections about the different uprisings, I'd like to start with a hopeful thought. Revolutions and uprisings for emancipation still occur, despite the fact that radical change through revolution has been delegitimized in the last 3 to 4 decades, following the shortcomings and defeat of the decolonization efforts in various parts of the global South, and in spite of the counter-revolutionary backlash aiming to crush people's will. Today's lecture would be structured in this way. We would like to start by giving an idea about the historical upheavals, what we call the Arab uprisings or the Arab Spring, and then go to debunking some myths and stereotypes about those uprisings and revolutions, and touch a little bit on the reaction and counter-revolution before going into 2 case studies, one on Sudan, and Muzan would give us her analysis on what's going on right now in the country, and the other on Algeria, and I'll do that. And then we'll finish by some final thoughts. I would like to say a few words about the naming of the region. We refer to that region in different ways. Some use Middle East or Middle East and North Africa, MENA region. Others refer to it as the Arab region, while others, including myself, prefer the less used coinage, North Africa and West Asia. Of course, no naming is perfect, and each has its own limits and detractors. Middle East is a geopolitical space that has been constructed by an opposition to the West. This designation is part of the legacy of what Edward Said calls Orientalism, a set of practices and discourses aimed at creating the other and constructing an imaginary about them to better master and exploit. In that respect, the East, the East, as I was saying, has been fashioned in a subordinate and secondary position to the West. The Middle East name also effaces some communal histories and shared experiences and geographies with other nations and people in Asia and Africa. The task in front of us, therefore, is partly about cultural and discursive decolonization that implies contesting how we are represented, how we are named, and how we are categorized. So I think that a more apt, surely not perfect, description of the region is perhaps a term rooted in geography like North Africa and West Asia. 11 years ago, and exactly on 14th of January 2011, after weeks of historic protests, Tunisians deposed their decades-long dictator Ben Ali. Inspired by this revolutionary development, Egyptians embarked on an equally inspiring revolt, which in barely 18 days culminated in the overthrow of Mubarak, another despot. These revolutionary uprisings shook the world in a few weeks and swept away Western-backed tyrants one after the other, in what is still undoubtedly among the most unforgettable historical events. The melodious chants, "The people want the fall of the regime," echoed across the region and across several continents, expressing a deeply self-emancipatory, transformative experience. And here I'd like to show two videos, one on Tunisia and one on Egypt. So the first one will be on Tunisia, video 1, and then the second one on Egypt.
معناها في وجوده الإنسان من يتولد الموت أحسن هدايا ينجم ياخذها وأنه يساهم في هالقيام تاع بلاده وهي تعارك ما توقف ما توقفش، مش هذاك المشكل، المهم هي قاعدة تحاول توقف.
فيها يا محمد ان شاء الله حقك ما يضيق يا محمد، يا محمد ان شاء الله حقك ما يضيعش يا محمد، ان شاء الله دمك ما يغبرش يا محمد. وليدي راك وليدي يا محمد، انت فتحت الابواب يا محمد، راك متي شهيد يا كبير. وباش ناخذوا ان شاء الله يا ربي، وربي هو اللي يهدي، وربي هو ارسل لذاك محمد البوعزيز اليتيم الشهيد، ربي يرسلوا باش يبين الحق كل الشباب هذايا.
عشان اخد حقي. ارحل يا ابو شير، الصعب خطير. افرحي يا ام الشهيد، افرحي يا ام الشهيد، افرحي يا ام الشهيد، افرحي يا ام الشهيد. ثورة تاني من جديد، ثورة تاني من جديد. احنا طلبة جماهيرية. بطل ورا وشكون ده لايف ستريمينج. والثورة هي الشرعية. تغيير، حرية، عدالة اجتماعية.
كنا مسجونين جوه هدومنا، مش جوه السجون، مسجونين واحنا ماشيين. النهارده انا جات لي فرصه ان انا ابني وابن اخويا وابن عمي واخويا اللي في بدايه التحرير برضه، انا مش اقل من اطالب بحقي، هو بيطالب بحق البلد كلها وانا بطالب بحق انا بس هنا. قول ما تخافش، المجلس لازم يمشي. قول ما تخافش، المجلس لازم يمشي. الحريه عليك وليا، الحريه عليك وليا، الحريه على الحر، الحريه على الثوار. يا الهويه،
تسترجع الميدان تاني بجد وتنزل وتاخد حقها. البلد دي عشان تقوم قومة لازم كلنا ننزل ونتكاتف مع بعض ونرجع زي الأول تاني.
ومعدنا 25 واحد تمديد الثورة إن شاء الله للقضاء على العسكر. 25 واحد هنشيل العسكر بإذن الله بإذن الله بإذن الله.
25 يناير اللي جاي إن شاء الله المجلس هيمشي فيه.
فيا ريت نعمل حسابنا يوم 25 يناير هنكمل المشوار.
بس يلا بينا نكمل الثورة. يا زنطاوي صحي النوم. يا زنطاوي صحي النوم.
I hope you got an idea about what I was talking about. Those uprisings were celebrated as world-changing events. The Tunisian and Egyptian revolutions ignited historic upheavals in North Africa and beyond. People there celebrated the toppling of their dictators, Mubarak and Ben Ali, and looked ahead for meaningful change to their situation. Those uprisings, like in most revolutionary situations, released enormous energy, a collective effervescence, an unparalleled sense of renewal and a shift in consciousness. Cultural production took on another meaning because it was associated with liberation and seen as a form of political action and solidarity. Far from the folkloric and sterile production under the suffocating patronage of some authoritarian elites, we saw instead a culture that speaks to the people and advances their resistance and struggles through poetry, music, theater, cartoons, and street art. Women also played a crucial role in the uprisings, as was seen in their strong presence in marches and protests in all the countries, including very conservative areas. They were actively involved in students and trade union movements. Some of them faced repression and even jail, but they continued to show their unflinching dedication to the struggles. The people of this region were long confined to racist stereotypes and contemptuous cliches of the like, Arabs and Muslims are not fit for democracy and they are incapable of governing themselves. The imperial and colonial dominance over the region has led to it being seen in some quarters as a homogeneous entity that can be systematically reduced through negative tropes. Seen through this distorting lens, the region evokes images of conflict and wars, ruthless dictators and passive populations, terrorism and extremism, as well as rich oil reserves and expansive deserts. This orientalist imaginary and the rigid representation of the other, as well as having the power to block narratives, are hallmarks of a political and geographical violence that is produced by imperialism. The so-called Arab Spring shattered these stereotypes and debunked these myths. The wind of revolution has spread from Tunisia to Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain, Jordan, Morocco, and Oman. The emancipatory experience was so contagious that people were inspired all over the world. Occupiers from London to Wall Street and the indignados were proud to walk like an Egyptian. Amidst this inspiring hope and people's power, the global nature of revolution has even been described by the French communist intellectual Alain Badiou as the communism of movement. These revolts had echoes in many countries in the Arab region because they shared the same detonators of the explosion: authoritarianism, inegalitarian development, high unemployment, especially among young graduates, poverty, endemic corruption and nepotism, a suffocated political life, repression, human rights abuses, a frustrated, educated youth without horizons, and parasitic bourgeoisies who continue their protected robbery, exploitation, and self-enrichment. Mainstream media Western governments, as well as international financial institutions, portrayed those uprisings as merely revolts against authoritarianism and essentially demanding political freedom and democracy of the stunted kinds that exist in Western industrial countries. This framing steers away from any class analysis and tends to dissociate the political from the economic, ignoring the fundamental socioeconomic demands of bread, social justice, dignity, and popular sovereignty. In the months following the uprisings in 2011, the head of the World Bank and other US and European spokespeople had attempted to render the revolts within a pro-market discourse, as if the people of these countries rose only against an intrusive state that has obstructed the pursuit of individual self-interest through the market. But the distortions did not stop there. The Tunisian and Egyptian uprisings were also dubbed by Western mainstream commentators as the Facebook and Twitter revolutions, exaggerating the role of social media in fomenting them. It goes without saying that social media platforms played a role, but they were a tool in the hands of revolutionaries and protesters rather than the locomotive of the uprisings. Another dominant but not less superficial framing was the demographic one, picturing the revolts as primarily youth uprisings against all generations, the product of a youth bulge in the affected countries. A decade later, while commemorating the 10th anniversary of these events, that was in 2021, the mainstream interpretations have not shown any sign of maturity. Several media reports and articles talked of failed and lost revolutions and broken promises here and there. But the dominant tone has been captured by a title of one Guardian article published in December 2020, referring to Mohammed Bouazizi, the street fruit vendor who set himself on fire, catalyzing the Arab uprisings. The title reads, "He ruined us. 10 years on, Tunisians curse men who sparked Arab Spring." The narrative that is being advanced is one of despair and hopelessness, implying that it was not worth revolting in the first place. Better to have remained in poverty and in chains. Such an interpretation needs to be strongly challenged and deconstructed in order to offer a more nuanced and a materialist analysis of revolution and what it entails. Nevertheless, we cannot deny that what started as historic events and inspiring uprisings against authoritarianism and oppressive socioeconomic conditions demanding bread, justice, and dignity morphed into violence and chaos, profound polarization, counter-revolutions, and foreign interventions. The various people's movements found themselves pitted against entrenched authoritarian and counter-revolutionary forces that were bent on suppressing them. All were met with resistance from the state, often in conjunction with global capital and foreign interference. The military coup in Egypt ended up restoring a much more ruthless and repressive form of dictatorship. The brutal descent into civil wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, and the succession of crackdowns in Gulf countries like Bahrain show the cynical proxy logic so reminiscent of the colonial schemes in the region that the region is all too familiar with. Tunisia, which seems to be the exception in this gloom and doom, is in a very fragile position, to say the least. Moreover, the deep polarizations, example, Islamist versus secularist, imposed on the masses have distracted them from the key socioeconomic issues that were at the heart of the uprisings in the first place. So what happened? Some mainstream commentators have argued that the Arab Spring gave way to an Islamist winter, with Islamist forces coming to power in some countries. Others declared that the Arab Spring was dead. Some progressive voices have been less pessimistic and had a more historical perspective, saying that these events should be seen within a long-term revolutionary process with ups and downs, as well as periods of radicalization and others of setback and counter-revolution. This latter view has been vindicated by the second wave of the uprisings a decade later, in 2018, between 2018 and 2021, and an escalation of the revolutionary process in the region in what is called the second wave of the uprisings in Sudan, Algeria, Iraq, Lebanon, and the heroic struggle of Palestinians, just to mention a few. These all show the people's determination to continue fighting for their rights and sovereignty. All of these momentous events between 2010 and 2021 have opened new horizons for people to express their discontent and demand radical change and reforms, forcing almost every government in the region to concede on issues, both political and economic. To summarize, I'd like to show a short video made by the Transnational Institute for the dossier I coordinated last year on the Arab uprisings. So Jadi, if you could show video 3, that would be great. And then Muzan would take from me. Thank you.
Well, this video that we just saw, all these videos are from last Friday, that's June 30th, 2022, in different Sudanese cities. We saw thousands marching. We saw protesters removing shipping containers that are used by the military coup forces to close the main bridges of the capital. And we saw them facing tear gas canisters that were shot directly at the protesters in less than 2 kilometers away from the presidential palace. On this day, 9 peaceful protesters were killed. Over 300 were detained around Sudan and hundreds more injured. In this protest of June 30th, it just refused to end. It turned into a sitting. It turned into multiple sittings, actually, in different areas in the capital, and marches from neighborhoods to the sit-ins and to the presidential palace that were repeated in the last few days since then. But to fully understand how we got to this point, we must start from 3 years ago and follow the track of the Sudanese revolution system. My name is Muzan Alneel. I'm a Sudanese activist and writer, and I would like to thank you for taking the time to join this discussion, as well as pass my thanks and appreciation to the organizers behind this event. I will try over the next few minutes to go over the recent history of the Sudanese revolution and the events that shaped it and continue to shape the future of all the actors involved. If we can start the presentation, please. Thank you very much. So, in the year 2018, Sudan was suffering from a failed economy. Inflation rose to 60%, and basic goods were scarce. The country fully depended on export of raw materials for decades, with minimum industrial processing, from exporting cotton in the years following the country's independence in the 1950s to exporting crude oil in the 2000s, creating a very fragile economy that wouldn't withstand the independence of South Sudan, where most of the oil was extracted. The country was under the rule of the military dictatorship for 30 years since a coup that took place in 1989. The coup sustained its rule via oppression, illegal detentions, torture, and assassinations of dissidents, and by creating tribal militias and starting civil wars and conflict around Sudan. And for years since the independence of the South, which took place in 2011, the government of Sudan has been dropping basic economic rights and just printing money at the face of every economic failure, thereby forcing the people of Sudan to pay the price of the governmental economic failure. By 2018, the situation was dire. Basic goods such as fuel and wheat were scarce. Under these circumstances, the government decided to double the price of bread from 1 Sudanese pound per loaf to 2 pounds. This triggered a protest by high school students in the city of Adbara in northeastern Sudan, which we see at the first photo at the left of the slide. The photo on the right is of the ruling party building in Adbara, the same city, which was burned during these protests. This photo went viral in Sudanese social media, on WhatsApp groups. A population that was already angry at the government that pushed it into poverty, this population was now excited by a photo that proves the ruling party can be fought and defeated. If we can go to the next slide, please. We see here that the protests continued around Sudan in the following weeks under the main slogan, "Tasqut bas," which means just fall. This slogan came as an answer to the messaging of the ruling party, which for years repeated that there is no alternative ready to take over the government, and therefore they shall remain in power. To that, the people answered, "We don't care, just fall," or in Sudanese Arabic, "Tasqut bas." The masses were mostly formed of women and youngsters, as you see in the photo to the top right in the slide. These are the demographic groups that carry most of the weight of the state's withdrawal from providing economic rights. It is women who had to provide unpaid healthcare for their families when hospitals became unaffordable, and it was the youngsters whose future prospects were crushed by lack of employment in a country that depended on raw material exports, which create very little jobs. And despite many neoliberal think tanks and media platforms trying to present the revolution in Sudan as a youth movement for generational reasons, as my colleague Hamza explained earlier, but it is in fact economic reasons at the base of it, as Hamza also explained. The protests were not the only form of resistance that the Sudanese people used. There were also strikes and civil disobedience actions, such as the one-day strike on the 5th of March, 2019. We see in the bottom left a photo of employees in one of Sudan's largest dams that were striking on that day and holding signs that spells freedom, peace, and justice. Revolution is the choice of the people. This is another slogan repeated by the protesters at that time. The protests remained peaceful, and as we see in the photo in the bottom right, the state security apparatus faced it with extreme use of tear gas that we see the protesters here throwing back at the state force, in addition to other weapons that they used as well, live bullets, detentions, assassinations. 90 peaceful protesters were killed by state forces in the period from December 2018 to April 2019 alone. If we can go to the next slide, please. On the 6th of April 2019, Sudanese protesters around the country marched to the military headquarters in their states. We see them around the military headquarters in the capital, Khartoum, in the photo to the top left. This started a sit-in calling for civilian government and an end of military rule in Sudan. And within 5 days, the sit-in managed to pressure the military to overthrow the head of state and form a military council as the new head of state. But the protesters rejected this new form of military rule and stood by their demands for civilian government. The sit-in in the capital grew, and as we see in the photo to the top right, this is a train of protesters entering the sit-in area coming from Atbara, the city where the first protest took place 5 months prior to that day. The growth of the revolution in numbers and strength was undeniable, as we can see. During these weeks, negotiations took place between the military council and the leadership of the opposition. We see a photo at the bottom right of one of those negotiation meetings. This leadership of the opposition was formed of a number of old and usual bourgeoisie parties. The negotiations were facilitated by the African Union and aimed towards creating a partnership setup between the military and the civilian opposition. And this was radically rejected by the protesters in the sit-in area. They wanted 100% civilian. Facing this dilemma, the army resorted to extreme violence. On June 3rd, 2019, the state forces attacked the sit-in area in the capital Khartoum and 13 other states simultaneously, killing in one day over 100 peaceful protesters. Some of them were thrown into the Nile River with bricks tied to their feet. There were 30 cases of rape registered on that day. Hundreds are injured, hundreds missing to this day. The government then shut down internet connection all over the country for more than a month in an attempt to suppress publishing evidence that documents its crimes, such as the photo that we see to the bottom right of protesters surrounded by state forces on that same day. If we may go to the next slide, please. As we said, there was a month following the massacre, that is a month of internet shutdown in the country and violence in the street by the state forces. During this month, protesters closed the streets with barricades, as we see in the photos over here, and called for a march of millions on June 30th, 2019, under a countrywide internet communication shutdown. This period strengthened the resistance front, and specifically the neighborhood resistance committees. These committees that were previously formed a few months ago to organize decentralized simultaneous protests across different neighborhoods, they became the main structure of networking, mobilizing, and organizing on the ground under internet shutdown. And under these circumstances, they managed to organize a successful millions march protest, calling for a fully civilian government, despite and at the face of the military violence and the massacre that took place less than a month before that day. In the second picture from the top, we see a photo of one of 4 marches that took place in the capital alone on June 30th, 2019. Protesters marched across cities and villages in Sudan and even in camps of internal displaced victims of conflict. However, and despite the strength of the popular call for a civilian government, the opposition leadership was made up of all the usual bourgeoisie parties, as we previously mentioned, signed the deal with the military council, creating a partnership government between the two and starting the transitional period in August 2019. And despite this partnership being frowned upon by the public, who called for a civilian government, it was the leadership of the opposition that took the role of taming down the public rejection and spreading a message that this partnership with the military was the only logical and rational path to a fully civilian government. If we may go to the next slide, please. In reality, the government formed by a partnership between the military generals and the civilian opposition failed to achieve the demands of the revolution. It was logically not possible to transform the economy, to deliver the economic rights of the Sudanese people without threatening the control of the army over public assets and natural resources. The army being a partner in the government would not allow that to take place, of course. The inflation increased to over 300% in the following 2 years as the government implemented economic policies of desubsidization and economic liberalization. And although these were the same policies of the previous regime, which led to the impoverishment of the majority of the population and triggered the protests that overthrew the previous head of state, nevertheless, these policies were approved and celebrated by the international monetary organizations. The failure to deliver on the demands of the revolution led to a continuation of protest actions, mostly organized by resistance committees and demand-based grassroots organizations. The reaction of the state resembled its reaction under the previous regime. State violence continued against revolutionaries, which included live bullets at the face of peaceful protesters, abductions, and assassinations of resistance committee members. And despite signing a peace agreement between the partnership government and rebel groups, violence also continued in conflict areas, and no month passed without news of militia attacks on farmers in western and southern parts of the country. It was clear that the conflicts between the interests of the military generals and the demands of the revolutions were not solvable. And so were the conflicts between the neoliberal economic policies and the revolutionary demands of freedom, peace, and justice. The resistance committees during these times walked a very fine line of standing by the demands of the revolution, but without creating a justification for a coup by the generals, as they were repeatedly told by the elite that this partnership must be protected as the most rational path to a civilian government. If we may go to the next slide, please. So nevertheless, a coup actually took place on October 25th, 2021. The people of Sudan woke up on that day to a shutdown of internet and phone communication. Radio channels scrambled, and news of the prime minister and the civilian cabinet being arrested by the heads of the military. The military partners ended the partnership. And as we can see in the photos from news coverage on that day, the Sudanese people went out to the streets directly and immediately. They were declaring their rejection of military rule one more time. Without phones and internet connection, the people just collectively went out to the streets, chanting the same slogans they chanted in 2018 and throughout the transitional period, demanding freedom, peace, and justice. There were also some new slogans about the battles previously delayed and a military rule that must be ended once and for all. If we can go to the next slide, please. In the following days, the resistance committees assumed the leadership of the protests. They issued schedules for protest actions across the country. What we see in the picture at the top is the crowds by the presidential palace in one of the many protest days. And what we see in the picture at the bottom is a snapshot of the battles the protesters go through against the violence of the forces of the state to reach the presidential palace and exercise their right of peaceful protest. These protests did not stop until this very second. The videos we saw earlier, as I explained, they were from the June 30th march. That is commemorating the march that took place on the same day on the year 2019, and affirming the commitment of the Sudanese revolutionaries to rejecting any form of military rule. That march turned into a sit-in in several cities, as I told you, around the country. And while several groups of revolutionaries headed again towards the presidential palace in the following 2 days, creating continuous state of battles between protesters and state forces in the main streets of the capital that go on up until the second. More than 112 peaceful protesters were killed by state forces since the coup in October. Some were shot with live bullets, others with tear gas canisters shot directly to protesters' heads and chests, among other weapons that the Sudanese state uses against its people. The people have utilized a number of resistance tools, not limited to protests. Strikes took place among teachers, petroleum workers, and even the judiciary for economic and political demands. Closing the major roads is another important tool that was used by the Sudanese people. Farmers in the north, for example, have closed the main road linking Sudan and Egypt in reject of a 500% increase of electricity tariff by the coup government. The demands of the farmers included the cancellation of the fee increase, the provision of necessary services for agriculture, and for this to be provided by a civilian government that represents them, not by the military government. Similar demands were also made by the residents of gold mining areas in the south and western areas who closed the roads to the gold mining areas. If we can go to the next slide, please. Now, in addition to the army generals, the Sudanese revolution is also facing a counter-revolutionary international community. Several attempts were actually made by national elite and international community to restore the partnership between the military and the civilians. This is understandable, of course, given that their interests lie in forcing stability and in silencing the public and accommodating international investments and capitalist profiting and economic liberalization at the cost of the Sudanese people's welfare and decent living. These attempts included a deal between the head of the military and the previously detained prime minister. The deal was praised by the international community and the UN Secretary General, who asked the Sudanese people to just be rational and accept this deal. But the Sudanese people did not accept it and chanted against the prime minister in protests that took place on the same day of the deal. The public gave him the title Prime Minister of the coup on that day. The deal failed in 1 month. The coup prime minister failed to form a cabinet or to end the protest, and he resigned and left the country. Another attempt at restoring the partnership with the military is led by the UN mission in Sudan. The mission is leading and advocating negotiations between the military generals and a number of Sudanese parties. Now, the photo that we see at the bottom shows one of those meetings. And as you can see, they were named consultation on political process, just to avoid using the word negotiations or deliberations, which are strongly rejected by the Sudanese public and the Sudanese revolutionaries. It is worth noting that the UN mission invited the resistance committee to join these negotiations, but rejected the committee's condition of live streaming the meetings, and that thereby confirms the lack of transparency and the questionable intentions of the UN's process. The resistance committees are the main political actor in the street, mobilizing protests for 8 months by now. Therefore, a process that doesn't include them has very little chances of success. So these attempts and many others have failed at the face of the popular resistance 3 no's slogan. That is the 3 no negotiations, no partnership, and no legitimacy for the military. If we can go to the next slide, please. Now, as we see in these photos and as we saw in the video earlier, despite the extreme violence of the state forces, the peaceful protests continue to be peaceful. And despite counter-revolutionary attempts by the national elite and the international community, the resistance committees are working towards a new form of government for a new Sudan. The pictures we see here are from a number of protests in the past 8 months. So we see trucks filled with riot police shooting tear gas directly at a protester. We see protesters at the Palace Street in the second photo using doors and windows as makeshift shields from police bullets. And we see other protesters with barrels as their shields that are covered with symbols of the resistance and paintings of the faces of the martyrs killed by the state forces. If we can go to the next slide, please. Looking at the current status of the Sudanese revolution, the main features of the current status are shaped by the 3-No slogan and by the clear impact of lessons learned from the past 3 years, which we can see in the commitment to transparency shown by the resistance committees and their reject of closed rooms meetings or backdoor meetings, basically. We see that also in the public's reject of compromises, as they learned by experience in the past 3 years that any compromise on revolutionary demands lays the ground for counter-revolutionary forces and their re-emergence. This is something we learned from our experience in Sudan, as well as the experiences that Hamza talked about in the region surrounding us. On the other side, the national elite and the international community continue to force a return to the military-civilian partnership, despite this clear reject by the Sudanese public. This process and deals have very little impact in reality in the Sudanese streets. The streets are more concerned with the political charters issued by the resistance committees. These charters define new roadmaps for governing Sudan and for the development and redistribution of power and wealth in the country. We see on the right here logos of 2 charters. At the top, the Revolutionary Charter of the People's Power, which is signed by resistance committees in 15 out of Sudan's 18 states, with the clear political economy analysis and approach that analyzes the hardship of the Sudanese people as the results of the rentier capitalist economy trajectory shaped by colonial powers and sustained by the local bourgeoisie. The charter also presents a new form of selecting government and starting from local councils to a national legislative body, guided by the demands of the revolution and by prioritization of human life and held accountable directly by the public. A second charter was issued by the resistance committees of the capital. And despite it being only one state, the capital is home to about a quarter of the population. And with its population being closest to the federal authorities, has a larger political weight than other states. We see at the bottom the logo of the Charter of the Establishment of the People Powers issued by the resistance committees in the capital. And this charter includes revolutionary values that can be spotted in different parts of the document, including the emphasis on no compromise on the people's rights to live. It also criticizes the political process for not addressing the economic, social, and cultural origins of Sudan's current crisis and highlighting the lack of sustainable development vision for the country. There are all points that are shared with the revolutionary charters that we talked about first. The two charters are currently undergoing a process of merging, as announced by the resistance committees, and the deliberations around them are shaping the Sudanese resistance front, among other conversations on economic and social rights, international relations, and governance. In this revolutionary time, a charter can reshape the political sphere, a march can trigger sit-ins across a country, and the details of a country's future are shaped by everyday events. If we can move to the last slide, please. In this picture, we see this young girl at a protest that is holding one of the most repeated slogans in the protest over the past month: power to the people and military to the barricades. This is how the Sudanese revolutionaries in the second wave of the 2018 revolution are centering redistribution of power and the end of the military rule. I hope this presentation managed to explain how such a slogan became central to the Sudanese revolution and the street tactics and battles that sustained it and continue to do so, and the political paths that are shaped by. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Muzan, for giving us your reflections and thoughts on the Sudan uprising. I'm gonna zoom now on the Algerian uprising. So the momentous events of 2019 in Algeria have been truly historic. The Algerian people won the first battle in their struggle to radically overhaul the system in early April 2019. Abdelaziz Bouteflika, the alien president, for the past 20 years was forced to abdicate after more than 6 weeks of street protests and the reconfiguration of alliances within the ruling classes. What started as a rejection of a candidacy of a physically unfit octogenarian president has transformed in face of the obstinacy and deceptive ploys of the ruling elites into a united rejection against the ruling system, with demands of radical democratic change, freedom, and justice. Next slide, please. So I was saying that for more than a year, and despite all obstacles and attempts to break the movement, millions of people, young and old, men and women from different social classes, have taken to the streets in an inspiring uprising, reappropriating long confiscated public space. Next slide, please. Historic Friday marches, followed by protests in several sectors, united people in this popular movement, or what Algerians called the Hirak. Next slide, please. The revolutionary movement in Algeria released the boundless creativity of the popular genius. When chanting, "We woke up and you will pay," the people have been expressing their newly discovered political will. The liberatory process is at the same time a transformative one. We have witnessed this in the euphoria, creativity, confidence, wit, humor, and joy that these people movements had inspired after decades of social and political suppression. Next slide, please. What made this movement really unique was its massive scale, peaceful character, and national spread, including in the marginalized South. The movement is also characterized by a significant participation of women, and especially young people, who constitute the majority of the population. Algeria has not witnessed such a broad, diverse, and widespread movement since 1962, 60 years ago, when they went to the streets to celebrate their hard-won independence from French colonial rule. Jadi, could you show video 5 now, please?
من أجلك عشنا يا وطني نفدي بالروح أراضينا قد كنا أمس عمالقة في الحرب نذل أعادينا وإن اليوم عمالقة في السلم حماة مبادينا من أجلك جيش التحرير وجبهته كان ضوئين بداجينا قال في البدء كرامتنا والشعب يسود هنا في
One can also see the uprising as the continuation of the anti-colonial struggle of the 50s and 60s. So many references have been made in the various protests and marches to the anti-colonial revolution and its martyrs, reaffirming that formal independence has no meaning without popular and economic sovereignty. Next slide, please. These anti-colonial sentiments are reasserted by a staunch hostility to any foreign interference and imperialist intervention, and by an unshakable solidarity with Palestinians in the permanent presence of the Palestinian flag alongside the Algerian ones. Algerians understand that their liberation won't be complete without the liberation of Palestine. This is unique in the Arab region and can be explained by Algeria and Palestine being the only countries in the region that experienced racist, genocidal settler colonialism. Next slide, please. The Algerian uprising should also be analyzed within the second wave of the Arab and African uprisings that started in 2010, 2011. The Algerian slogan, "Al-Shab yurid yitnaha waqa," the people want them all to go, is just another version of "Al-Shab yurid isqat al-nizam," the people want the overthrow of the system, the slogan that we've seen in all Arab uprisings in 2010, 2011. Next slide, please. The movement was youth-led and relatively loose. There were no clearly identifiable leaders or organized structures that were propelling it. The almost sacralization of spontaneity, leaderless movements, and the hostility to any form of restructuring is not unique to the Algerian case, but has been seen in other uprisings and revolutions like in Egypt, Tunisia, Lebanon, and Iraq. It is worth noting that students, workers, especially those in the education sector, autonomous trade unions, judges, and lawyers have been playing a very important role in these mobilizations as they participated and organized their own actions, calling for strikes and keeping the momentum going. So unlike Sudan, where the Sudanese professional associations, alongside the local committees, has been playing a sort of a leading role and organizing structure, in Algeria, things got largely organized horizontally and mainly through social media, where calls for protests and strikes were made. Next slide, please. So what are the political elements that gave rise to this popular movement? The country has been experiencing a political crisis for decades, in particular since the 1992 military coup and the ensuing brutal civil war. The most recent manifestations of this crisis are the direct results of the politics of parasitic accumulation and entrenched corruption enforced by a militaro-oligarchic nexus that denies the Algerian people the right to self-determination and dispenses with popular legitimacy for the benefit of domestic and international capital. This crisis has been exacerbated by several factors, including the intra-elite power struggles, which are symptomatic of the deep-seated contradictions and instability of the current ruling bloc, and the crisis of hegemony within it, which has opened up new spaces for resistance. The decisive entrance of the people into the political stage in 2019 effectively forced the military high command to distance itself from the presidency and intervene in order to safeguard the regime in place. Next slide, please. The Hirak didn't come from nowhere. It is the expression of decades of profound pain, anger, and rejection of the repressive authoritarianism, suppression of freedoms, economic and social exclusion, as well as the lack of horizon, especially for the unemployed youth who are still risking their lives to reach the northern shores of the Mediterranean to escape the despair and the humiliation of being marginalized and relegated in their own countries. It is also important to say that this eruption of popular anger is the result of an accumulation of struggles and acts of resistance that date back to the 80s, the most recent examples being the resident medical doctors protests in 2018, the anti-fracking uprisings of the 2015, the labor mobilizations, especially in the education sector in 2011, 2012, and the unemployed movement since 2012 in the Algerian Sahara. Next slide, please. The uprising came at a time of an acute economic crisis characterized by crippling austerity measures following the decline of oil and gas export revenues since 2015. So in the midst of increasing popularization and employment and even development and corruption, the rationality of the current revolt and rebellion becomes absolutely clear. In my view, the causes of the revolt, the 2019 revolt, were fundamentally economic and are the result of more than 3 decades of neoliberal restructuring, the Bouteflika era being the most ultra-liberal era in Algeria's history, selling off of public companies, deindustrialization, and a setting up of an import bazaar economy. When oil prices are high, this allows for buying social peace, but when they fall down, as in the case since 2016 and during the pandemic, this leads to austerity measures, adding to the burden of ordinary people. Next slide, please. We cannot fully appreciate the political situation in Algeria without scrutinizing foreign influences and interferences and apprehending the economic question from the angle of natural resource grabs and energy neocolonialism. This includes the enormous concessions made to multinationals and the pressures coming from outside to execute further liberalization in order to remove all restrictions to international capital and fully integrate Algeria into the global economy in a totally subordinate position. The cases of the budget laws of 2020, 2021, and the new hydrocarbon law are edifying in this respect. The new hydrocarbon law, for example, that is friendlier to multinationals and which offers more incentives and concession for them to invest, epitomizes this tendency and opens the way to some destructive projects, such as the exploitation of shale gas in the Sahara and offshore resources in the Mediterranean. As for the budget laws of 2020 and 21, they reopened the door for international borrowing and imposed some austerity measures by lifting various subsidies and cutting public spending. In the name of encouraging foreign direct investment, what we call FDIs, they exempted multinationals from tariffs and taxes and increased their share in the national economy by removing the 51-49% rule, investment rule, that limits the part of foreign investment in any project to 49%, undermining national sovereignty even more. Next slide, please. Throughout the 2 years of the uprisings, 2019 and 2020, we've seen a radical evolution of slogans and demands. The main ones, one, where they must all go, and the chants of we want a civilian, not a military state, and Algeria is a republic, not a military barrack. And then we had others like generals to the trash bin, and Algeria will be independent. Next slide. The COVID-19 pandemic has, in a way, been a blessing to the ruling classes in Algeria. The military regime has been doubling down on its repressive actions with complicity from foreign powers. Hundreds of activists have been jailed since the start of the lockdown, including some close friends and comrades. The regime has not stopped at this. It continues tightening restrictions on media, attempting all it can to do to divide, exhaust, and suffocate the movement. The counter-revolutionary campaign underway in my country is not driven solely at the local level, but also by a constellation of regional and international states and corporate actors. Regionally, we have the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Egypt have been throwing their weight to crush any emancipatory impulses in large parts of Africa and West Asia. And globally, we have the main Western powers, along with major oil, media, and tech corporations that have been playing especially an auspicious role. However, I think that the popular movement has not said its last word yet, and that's what I hope and what I believe. Next slide. And I think I'm going to summarize now before opening to questions. It's about the lessons learned, to be learned from all these uprisings in the last decade. Revolutions are powerful and inspiring moments that release a huge amount of energy, but at the same time, they face formidable challenges and difficulties that need to be overcome through continuous organizing and a coherent strategic thinking to shift the balance of forces toward the popular masses. We need to think about these uprisings in terms of revolutionary processes rather than as events that either succeed or fail. Revolutions are often referred to as such only in retrospect, once they have succeeded in overthrowing a ruling class or a regime. This process can take years, if not decades, and frequently fails. Even the most celebrated revolutions did not unfold without cycles of ebbs and flows, and they were decades in the making. For example, the widely celebrated French Revolution took around 8 decades, and several rounds of conflict and counter-revolution before the First Republic was established. Even the Russian Revolution of 1917 can be understood as a broader political process that started in 1905 and then had several episodes before the final blow was struck against the Tsarist regime in 1970. Hence, it is important not to dismiss or downplay the role of these experiences as long-term processes shaping and transforming the political imaginaries of people in their everyday lives. I'd like to finish by mentioning a few important points in guise of lessons to learn. First, movements would burn out if they were left without organizational structure. Many revolutionary activists and scholars emphasized the necessity of a revolutionary political party, or perhaps an organized social movement that can take the demands of the masses forward and be a tool in the hands of people. Second, the radical and revolutionary left has a huge task confronting them, the task of putting the socioeconomic issue at the center of the debate around alternatives and injecting a class analysis and an anti-imperialist frame into the broad movements. We need to heed Fanon's warning when he urges us to move from a national toward a socio-political consciousness. Third, radical change is not a programmed push-button operation. It is a protracted political process requiring confrontation and sacrifices that at certain times lead to a path paved by long struggles and accumulated experiences. To paraphrase a saying familiar to Muslims, let's work for radical change as if it would take an eternity to realize, and let's prepare the ground for it as if it's going to happen tomorrow. Finally, for acts of resistance to succeed, they need to create enduring global alliances and international solidarities in the face of capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. Next slide. In 2020, a global revolt against white supremacy started in Minneapolis following the police murder of George Floyd. Like Eric Garner before him, his last words were, "I can't breathe." The ensuing global solidarity with Black Americans show that we can no longer breathe under capitalism. And this is evidenced again by the death of African migrants in Melilla last week. We must revisit the past and interrogate the history of the last 6 decades and learn the lessons from what went wrong. Both Algeria and Fanon can once again be a linkage in these global struggles as they were in the 60s and 70s. Next slide, please. The lessons from the experiences of anti-racist and anti-colonial internationalism in the 60s and 70s should be heeded today. We need to revive those projects that sought full emancipation from the imperialist capitalist system. As part of this, it is essential that we rediscover the revolutionary heritage of the Maghreb, Africa, West Asia, and the global South, developed by great minds like Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, Thomas Sankara, Walter Rodney, and Samir Amin, to mention just a few. Building on this revolutionary heritage and applying its internationalist perspective to the current context is of utmost importance to Algeria, Sudan, to the BLM movement, and other emancipatory struggles globally. And the last slide, I will now finish this lecture showing you an excerpt from a documentary about the first Pan-African cultural festival that took place in Algiers in 1969, just as for inspiration. Video 6, please, Jadi.
Namibia shall be free, whatever happens. We will fight to the last minute. Our country, our people will be liberated. We will liberate our soil by our own hands. Namibia shall be free.
Down with colonialism and down with imperialism.
Colonialism, 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 we shall fight until we win. Colonialism, we shall fight until we win. Imperialism, imperialism, we shall fight until we win. Imperialism, we shall fight until we win. Colonialism, colonialism, we shall fight until we win. Colonialism, we shall fight until we win. Imperialism, imperialism, we shall fight until we win. Imperialism, we shall fight until we win. Colonialism,
Two quite extraordinary presentations. Thank you, Hamza. Thank you, Muzan. This was quite an extraordinary session. We have many questions coming in from the Chinese audience. But if I might just make a comment and perhaps a suggestion about some provocation I can provide. Both of you have focused on the immense opposition and mobilization that has taken place in all these countries, in Sudan, in Algeria, and so on. And it's really inspiring that what both of you focus on is how it is a people's revolution. It's people mobilizing on those. And you've hinted at some of the creativity that is associated with these mobilizations. But what I would really like to hear more about is, and I think, Muzan, you touched on it towards the end, is the alternative state structures, the alternative ways of organizing, because it's not sufficient for there to be merely opposition, there has to be proposition. And Hamza, you made reference to Amilcar Cabral, and perhaps the most interesting issue to arise out of Cabral's writings was the creation of alternative structures within the liberated zone, the banning of Portuguese currency, the creation of alternate economic systems. And I just wonder whether perhaps we can start with Muzan just saying, tell us more about the thinking and the debates going on around the creating of the alternative, which grows out of opposition, but becomes propositional for a new human emancipation.
Yes, thank you. I think that's a great question and a great focus to have on, especially during these days, especially that the Sudanese revolutionaries and protesters are being faced with a message that says that they do not have something to offer, basically, instead of what they are rejecting. But the Sudanese resistance front has provided, in the past few months, a lot of propositions of what kind of new structure of state they are thinking about. As I said, the charters represent most of it, or represent the most prominent of it, where the charters focus on, for example, focus basically on what kind of a government structure are they considering. And that will be one, in one of the charters, it's very clear, starting from neighborhood councils that will manage their own neighborhoods and then network with other councils via delegates, and start to build a new structure for the new government in the new Sudan. Actually, when this charter first came, they said, let's start from the district or from municipality level. So let's work with the municipality structure and start creating councils on that level. However, in one of the public discussions of the charter, I remember seeing that somebody just came to the discussion, held a mic and said, I work at the Ministry of Agriculture. So I go around the country trying to help farmers. And I know that the municipalities that are created were not created to serve the people. They were created so the state can have better control over them. And therefore, I do not think we should start from this level. We should start from scratch and build a whole new system. And people directly adopted that. So there are some details that the charters provide a lot of them, but the details are very dynamic and changing via discussion. So what one person would say in a panel in one town in Sudan, all of a sudden can go through the network of discussions that are happening and become the new definition of the new Sudan. Those charters also have, to some extent, clear visions of the wealth distribution. In my opinion, what is still lacking is the wealth creation. How do you create wealth in a manner that is just? And then you can distribute it in a manner that is just. But how do you even create it in a manner that is just, especially that this is a country that is dependent on gold mining and with all the negative impacts of gold in the areas that is taking place. So people are starting now to think about industrialization, or starting to think about what kind of a sustainable economy we can have that is not dependent only on raw material and so on. But as I said, it's a very dynamic process that is shaped every day and with every discussion and event.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think that the issue of who decides what is produced, how it's produced, for whom it's produced, and who benefits from that, I think are key questions that are not just for Sudan, but I think for all of us, wherever we be. Hamza, can I ask you to talk a little bit about that creativity, that I mean, the question is posed, and I think Cabral was very critical of this. Can you actually occupy the colonial state and expect it to deliver anything different? So if that's not the proposition, if you can't make a lion a vegetarian, what kind of structure do we need to do? What are the processes? Give us a hint of what's happening in Algeria, for example, in terms of that creativity that's going on.
Unfortunately, what is happening in Algeria right now is repression. There is no popular movement, Firoz. Unfortunately, they crushed it down during the pandemic, and it's not just because of repression and suppression. There are also internal contradictions within those popular movements and weaknesses when it comes to a lack of coherent strategy, a vision that can mobilize widely, and those are where, for me, fatal mistakes. And your question is a very valid one that we need to grapple with. I wish, like I had the prescription or the blueprint of how to do a revolution, but like from my presentation, what I wanted to emphasize is that those uprisings, those moments, those events are learning grounds where experiences are accumulated, and the hope is that mistakes do not get repeated again. But sometimes they do. Unfortunately, sometimes they do. In terms of the question of the state, Firoz, I am a believer that we need to decolonize the state. We need to change its nature, because the ruling classes in our countries, in the African continent and other parts of the global South, I think they are comprador, subordinate elites that serve the interests of domestic and international capital. They are not there to serve the interests of their own people, unfortunately. And Fanon analyzed that since the 60s. He was talking about how the national bourgeoisies end up, perpetuating that same colonial system that is oppressing people. But at the same time, I feel that we need a strategy. I think two ways. These are just thoughts. Maybe Firoz, you have give us some of your wisdom. I feel that we need to capture the state. The state is a powerful actor with a repressive, military and security apparatus, and some financial means that we could use to redistribute the wealth. Like in the case of Algeria, it's a very rich country in oil and gas. So where does that wealth go? So we need to capture that state and transform it. And I think that's a long strategy that needs debate within social movements, within revolutionary political parties, within revolutionary-minded activists and scholars. But at the same time, as you say, we need to start building the alternatives. And I feel that's what was missing, at least in the Algerian movements and in other movements in the region. We were just saying no to this, no to this, no to this, and we were not putting firm proposals. And I don't think we can expect a lot from these movements coming from decades of suppression and fragmentation and repression. But I think for me, it is a lesson that you need to build that dual power at the same time, which means organize, organize, organize everywhere. you organize in the workplace, you organize in farms, you organize in factories, you organize in neighborhoods, and then you try to converge and create that huge alliances of working people that go from urban to rural areas, that include informal workers, that include unemployed, that include women, other marginalized groups, and you try to mobilize them. But this is a long-term thing. So how to do it on the ground, it's very challenging. You definitely will be repressed. And these are revolutions. We've seen them in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Some of them were pretty bloody, right? I don't know if that was helpful, but
I think it was very, very helpful. I mean, I think it poses the dilemma, taking hold of the state. Can you change it, make a tank into a hospital? I mean, I think that's a fundamental problematic. There are lots of questions coming in from more than 1,400 viewers on this on the Bilibili channel. Perhaps I can sort of try and bring some of the questions together for Muzan. I mean, in terms of what is happening in Sudan, I mean, to what extent were the mobilizations urban based? What were the conditions of mobilization and organizing of rural people, and what were their demands? And we often don't hear about those. Perhaps you could help us understand that.
Yes, sure. Well, actually, the mobilization started in the rural areas, as I said in the beginning, and given the nature of the country and it's centralized, it's not only centralized in terms of having the power in the center, but you also have the services in the center. If you look at the map of any services in Sudan, anything will look like a star starting from the capital, whether it's like the electricity grid, it's a star that starts from the capital. The roads, it's a star that starts from the capital. Everything is centralized. Accordingly, when the protests got to the capital and got to the big cities took over the picture. All the protests in the rural areas continued, but the cities is what got the coverage, whether it's in media platform or even the national interest was more turned into focusing on what's happening in the cities, with the idea that if you're going to have change, you're going to have change coming from the cities. That was mostly in 2018. And that time we were thinking also that we need to take over the state, and the state existed in the cities and the capital. Therefore, that's where the action needs to take place. As the urban areas took over the narrative a bit more, also, it was not just the urban areas, it was the elite. It was the bourgeoisie of the urban areas and the upper middle class of the urban areas. And by default, they, of course, pushed back the economic demands, and the demands became more of political liberal demands, more of political participation and expression than talking about availability of food and health and so on. And that also very much suited the type of transitional government that we had and the neoliberal supporters around this transitional government. Actually, by the end of the 2 years of the transitional government prior to the coup, we had conflicts actually between the urban and the rural area, coming from the fact that the urban areas or the resistance bodies in the urban areas were reaching out to the resistance bodies in the rural areas. So because they could sense a coup is coming and wanted to plan for this coup. At the same time, the people in the rural areas, what they felt is that we went out to protest, but when the government came down, you forgot about our demands. We are not participating in your revolution again, since our demands are not included. But after the coup, what happened is that the coup put us in this place where we saw a clear enemy, and we had the lessons of the past 2 years not to deprioritize the economic demands. And this, to some extent, brought a coherency or a collaboration between the rural and urban areas, not fully understanding it, but to a level much higher in what we saw in 2018, 2019. And that is clearest in the two charters. As I said, we had one charter signed by 15 states around the country, out of the 18 states in the country, and one that is the capitals. And that tells you about the weight that the two sides have. But at the same time, it's the one that is coming mostly from the rural areas that is addressing the real issues and even pushing the charter from the capital into further revolutionizing and further radicalizing their demands.
I mean, I get a question for both of you, and you know, what have been the economic demands, especially for economic sovereignty, and what were the strategies for delinking from the domination of foreign capital and transnational corporations? Perhaps we'll start with you, Muzan, and then we'll go back to Hamza.
Sure. The economic demands at the beginning were very everyday demands. So we had bread was a clear demand that we want bread that is affordable. Right now, one of the most repeated slogans in the streets is صحة وتعليم مجان, which is basically free healthcare and education. That's what people are asking for. صحة وتعليم مجان والشعب يعيش في أمان والعسكر بالسكنات والجنجويد الحل, which means free healthcare and education, security for the people, the military back to the barricades, and the militias to be dissolved. That's what the people are demanding. So the demands are very clear and very everyday. Regarding delinking from the international organizations or even countries that would have demands that conflict or interests that conflict with these economic demands, Sudan was a very special case because Sudan has been under sanctions, American sanctions, for around 20 years prior to the revolution. So for a very long time, it was actually even those countries that have supported the policies of economic liberalization with the transitional government, these same countries were supporting the protests of the Sudanese people against the same policies when it was from the previous regime. So even in the eyes of the public, a clear link between the government and the international community was not there. We saw that only during the transitional period. And during the transitional period, it was heavy, actually. We saw that although our economic situation is extremely deteriorating, there was a lot of propaganda coming from the West to support the transitional government in these policies. And the results of that came out right now in the clear reject of the people for the interferences of the international community. However, it is yet to be, maybe with the exception of the charters, where it's very clear in the charters, but in some slogans, but we still see that sometimes a good percentage of the public would be looking forward to something coming from the international community, but the international community always manages not to disappoint with horrible counter-revolutionary attempts that are very clear to the people and leads more and more people away from these organizations and states.
So Hamza, give us some idea about France's dominance, the international capital dominance. What were the demands and what should be being discussed in terms of delinking, as Samir Amin would say, from those processes?
Maybe I'll focus on some concrete examples, maybe from Algeria and Tunisia, so people can see the dynamics of global capital and how it plays a counter-revolutionary role in those processes. So at the time of the uprising in Algeria, so I'll start with Algeria and then I'll go to Tunisia. There were already processes to liberalize or to further liberalize the oil and gas sector. So let's just focus on the oil and gas sector. So the regime or the ruling class in Algeria wanted to pass a multinational law that is friendly to multinationals, and they really wanted to undermine the 51-49% investment rule. And the moment they put that law to be discussed in parliament, and that was around, I believe, November 2019. People went spontaneously in the streets in Algiers, thousands of people in a working day, because usually the Algerian protest movement has been protesting every Friday, which is a weekend in Algeria. But when they heard about that rule, they went to the streets and they said, we don't want this law. We don't want to further undermining of our national and economic sovereignty. And the same thing happened a few weeks later when the president, the newly elected president, Tebboune, announced that they're gonna frack for gas. They're gonna use all the resources we have in Algeria and continue the same predatory extractivist model. People went into the streets in the Friday march and the demands were clear. The chants were clear. If you want to frack, go and frack in Paris, in reference to the French multinationals, Total, that were interested in those projects. Tunisia, following the uprising, the revolution 2010-2011, international financial institutions, the European Union, and various international actors were quick in their efforts and attempts to contain the uprising, to contain the revolution, to shape it into some narrow paths of what they call transparency, good governance, private sector, liberalize. If you want money, that's what you should be doing. So there was the Deauville partnerships, where several countries and several international financial institutions, including the World and the IMF, that met and decided we're gonna have this package of money that we're gonna give to these countries in transition. The countries in transition at the time were Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco, and I believe Jordan. And the idea is to maintain the same economic system, to privilege multinationals and other companies, to make them continue expatriating their profits at the expense of, people's demands. But in Tunisia, there was at least a resistance, a popular resistance in the first 2-3 years. And when we talk about delinking, like from that system, the tools that are leaving people in chain are clear. The debts. Those countries are indebted, hugely indebted, like contracted by authoritarian elites. And those countries cannot pay them if they really want to free themselves economically. So there were calls for the cancellation of debts. Unfortunately, those campaigns have been defeated. The other tool of the imperialist domination are free trade agreements. Free trade agreements basically come to your country and tell you, open up your borders to all foreign capital, to our multinationals. You need to use our criteria for producing, undermining, small-scale food producers, small-scale producers in local industries, and maintaining the country's even dependent. And there are many other tools that have been used by global capital, to silence, de-radicalize, evacuate, the true revolutionary content of those uprisings. I think I'll stop here.
That's very helpful. I think those and the material that you published and the TNI has published about some of these aspects, I think, are really important to refer to. I mean, I think both of you made the point that that revolutions are not linear. They have ups and downs, and it takes time to achieve. And I think what I find very interesting is that one of the participants in this seminar is somebody named Adriana Moreno Celi from Colombia. And we have seen in Latin America these ups and downs, and the victory, even if it is an electoral victory and a very fragile one at the moment in Colombia, I mean, I think is another example of the kind of experiences that you've both referred to. That what is happening on the African continent, and it is not merely North Africa, as our previous speakers have talked about, but there is this connection with the the uprisings, the different paths and ups and downs that happen in Latin America. Perhaps I can ask you, for you, what inspiration does the movements and the uprisings that have happened in Latin America been an influence in your thinking? Muzan.
What we got from South America, there's a mix of hope and a mix of hope and fear, both of them, because you need to remember that in the past a few years we saw wins for the people in South America, as well as we saw great losses that scared the whole world, not just in South America, but also in North America and in Europe. But I think in general there's a better understanding that we get of our national context from seeing the same things happening in another context. In some way, that kind of abstract the problems. For me personally, that kind of helped me understand what's happening in Sudan, because things get normalized once you are living in that context. But once you see it in another one, it becomes very clear. I would just like to share an anecdote that links Sudan and North America in a way that maybe not known to many. Is that there was an area in the sitting that took place in 2019, and this area it was the area of the where the most rebellious of the youngsters were, the ones who cared the least, for example, about old traditions and so on. And this area of the sitting was used actually by the military to justify the massacre, that there are indecent actions taking place by those youngsters and that we need to go and end it. This area is known in Sudan as Colombia. It's just a name that the youngsters gave it. That Colombia is the place where they go and be totally free. And it started a big discussion among the Sudanese revolutionaries in 2019, regardless, does Colombia represent the revolution or does Colombia not represent the revolution? So you had the people who are very traditional and kept saying, no, our revolution needs to stick by our traditions and those do not represent us. And you have the more radical and rebellious who insisted that the most radical of us and the most disadvantaged of us, those are the ones who represent the young and the homeless and the poor are residing is the area that represents the revolution. And this can confuse some people when Googling the resistance in Sudan and then finding all these discussions about whether Colombia represents the Sudanese revolution or not. But showing a very clear link and exposure between the different movements.
Great. Okay, well, we're coming up to nearly 2 hours on this. You've been both very generous with your time and your knowledge, and it's been extraordinary, really a very rich presentation from both of you. Hamza's last words?
Yes. So just to reply to your question about what people learn from each other, because I believe that experiences are shared widely, especially in our day and age. There are technologies, there are social media, people hear about each other's struggles and uprisings and get inspired from each other. And that's what happened in the Arab region. That's what happened in Africa. So people get inspired from each, they follow each other. So what is happening right now, for example, in West Africa, where there is a popular challenge to French imperialism, is an inspiration to North Africans as well. And there are those dynamics as well. What happens in North Africa influences other regions. And we know how, the popular uprising in Libya have been crushed with imperialist interventions in there, destabilizing the country and destabilizing the whole region, leading also to destabilization in West Africa, like in Mali. So those connections happen. I just want to say that at the height of the Algerian uprising, there were massive and inspiring demonstrations in Chile as well. And people were, and you see that in slogans, people to connect with each other and learn from each other. Personally, I learned a lot from Latin American reflection and struggles, especially when it comes to challenging, the Eurocentric development discourse and extractivism. There is a lot of going on, struggles are ongoing, which gives hope to the future, but there are challenges and we need to learn from the mistakes. We need to be strategic in the alliances we build. We need to go beyond the national to the regional to the international. I always like to repeat this. It is very important. We are fighting one system and our response to it needs to be anti-systemic and global.
Well, I mean, one of the slogans that always comes up in Latin America is "A luta continua." Unfortunately, in much of Africa, we tend to translate that as "the looting continues." But leaving that aside for the moment, I'd just like to express, on behalf of everyone who's been involved in this organizing of these webinars, but also the 1,600 people who have joined us from Bilibili, I'd like to express a real gratitude to you, Muzan, for really revealing and enlightening perspective about Sudan, and Hamza, that your ability to just talk with authority over such a wide range of countries is really impressive. So thank you very much indeed for joining us.